saw your hits. I've always wanted to say that. I think my inner evangelical preacher just comes out when I get in front of audiences of unreconstructed heathens and sinners and others. Welcome. And thank you to the Center for Inquiry for having me this morning. I am going to frame the majority of my comments vis-a-vis the political turbulence that this country is experiencing, the extreme, grave, egregious backlash against civil and human rights, and also look at this in terms of the intersection of humanism, feminism, contemporary politics, and cultural relevance. So I'm going to begin with an evocation of these questions as it pertains to the lived experiences of my students. I teach in South LA high schools. I've developed a young women's leadership project that really focuses on building bridges between young African American and Latina women, focusing on their cultural capital, their cultural knowledge, and their connection to the collective struggle of social justice that they have forged, that unfortunately they've been disenfranchised from. In 1781, black and brown women and men founded the city of Los Angeles. In this so-called city without a history, legend has it that undocumented Anglos were the real OG illegals. A few years before, a new revolution in what it meant to be human unfolded on the opposite shore in the British colonies. My students know the romance of the American Revolution, but not the secret of Los Angeles. In the prison house of textbook history, they know each other as enslaved niggers and wetback interlopers. Growing up in the same neighborhoods, elbow to elbow, cheek by jowl, they are taught to believe that black and Latino culture can be distilled down to media stereotypes, to get rich or die trying hip-hop and ghetto dysfunction, big Catholic families, and job-stealing illegals. As kindergartners, they were taught to cite the Pledge of Allegiance as sacred chapter and verse, hand solemnly over heart, in homage to royal theft. Founding myths of heroic white men bootstrapping to liberty are intimately bound to their imagination of the classroom, to its rhythm of shrill discipline and stench of ground chalk, to a regime of time in which white supremacy and narratives of progress are the currency of American faith. Over the past few decades, progressive education reform activists have reshaped the dialogue about the so-called achievement gap in public schools. Culturally relevant or culturally responsive pedagogy that builds on the lived experiences, cultural knowledge, language, and worldviews of children of color have become a standard, if still controversial, approach to addressing race and class disparities in education. Culturally relevant pedagogy rejects myths of meritocracy, colorblindness, and exceptionalism. At its most radical, it critiques institutional structures of racist power and control that render children of color invisible within mainstream curriculum and instruction. It is based on the view that the question of what it means to be moral, to be a citizen, and to be human is implicit within the politics of education. So how does cultural relevance relate to radical humanism? What is the connection between humanism and social justice in the so-called post-racial era? After President Obama's election, the mainstream media giddily trumpeted post-racialism as the new norm. There was much speculation about whether, say, Black History Month, long commodified and domesticated as a quick and dirty way to pay homage to the other, was still relevant. Was it redundant now that there was an African-American first family in the White House and Sasha and Malia were the new girls next door? But of course, no one ever caricatured Bill Clinton, backslapping, rib-eating, good old boy, philandering Bill Clinton as a bone-in-the-nose, bongo-playing savage or the son of apes. And no one ever caricatured Hillary Clinton as an ape or missing link. Yet, of course, these were some of the images that prevailed after the election. And these images underscored that we are still, to use the parlance of Bell Hooks, an African-American feminist activist, that we are still a white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy that the U.S. has not suddenly morphed into this exceptional, colorblind, post-racial democracy. And in fact, as we know, many white folk woke up after the election and proclaimed that the end times were upon us, that the dark clouds of apocalypse had descended, and that we needed to take back our country. And so egregiously enough, some white liberal pundits and even some white progressives assessed this backlash as a populist backlash that was oddly lacking in people of color. Instead of assessing the backlash, as many pundits of color did, as a white nationalist insurgency. And according to public religion research, a majority of Americans believe that God has conferred the United States with a special place, a special destiny in history. And speaking before a group of homeschoolers, former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, who's also a presidential hopeful, framed this discontent this way. He said, "You have been given a great gift in living in the greatest country in the history of the world, but that freedom, that equality, that exceptionalism is at stake right now if we do not replace the current president." And this notion that exceptionalism is under attack is exemplified by the backlash that we have seen against healthcare reform, against undocumented immigrant rights, against family planning, abortion rights, gender justice, public employee unionism, and in short, the very foundation of social welfare in the United States. Also in this poll, the Public Religion Research Survey indicated that 44% of Americans believe that discrimination against whites has become just as bad as that against minorities. 75% of those who identify with the Tea Party believe this to be true, and a majority of those who characterize themselves as Christian evangelicals believe this to be true, white Christian evangelicals. A new survey has come out which has concluded that many whites now believe that they are the primary targets of racism in the United States. And so what does it mean in this toxic political climate to be an African American humanist and atheist, and how have race, gender, class, and morality intersected with each other in terms of this hijacking of public morality? I want to put this in some historical and intellectual context. In 1927, A. Philip Randolph, civil rights organizer, socialist, and humanist, sponsored this interesting essay writing contest for his journal, The Messenger. And The Messenger was one of the premier radical black journals of the era. And the essay writing contest was called, "Is Christianity a Menace to the Negro?" To repeat, is Christianity a menace to the Negro? Now, again, this was the late 1920s. And it's a theme that is really inconceivable in this era of black hyper-religiosity and prayer cult nation hysteria. But the late 1920s was a period in which there were, quote, commies lurking behind every bedpost, and it was better to be dead than red. Political radicals were associated with godlessness, and vice versa. And Randolph was constantly being investigated for his so-called politically seditious activities. Also during this period, 1928, Anella Larson, the Harlem Renaissance author, writes her landmark work, Quicksand, which is one of the first explicitly skeptic black feminist critiques of the stifling gender norms of the black church. And Larson's protagonist, Helga Crane, was considered to be something of an oddball nonconformist who bucked the black authenticity police, not only because she was openly disdainful of organized religion, but also because she was a biracial woman who was struggling to achieve a sense of self and identity betwixt and between two very different cultures, that of 1920s predominantly African-American Harlem and Copenhagen, Denmark, which was the country of her mother's birth. And she traveled between the two cultures. And so In one really illuminating passage, Helga decries what she perceives to be the absurdity of black slavish devotion to the white man's God. Black devoutness struck her as odd, given the depth of black poverty. Religious devotion was dysfunctional for black people because it blunted the perceptions, it robbed life of its crudest truths. Religion especially had its uses for the poor, for the blacks, how the white man's God must laugh at the great joke he played on them, bound them to slavery, into poverty and insult, and made them bear it. And so, Helga's rejection of the Christian entreaty to take the possibility of redemption on faith, despite unrelenting earthly evil, misery, and suffering, becomes the catalyst for her retreat from the religious dogma of the African American community. After the book's publication, Anella Larson's probing exploration of the ministry was uneasily received by some. As a woman who, quote, did not believe in religion herself and was considered unconventional for the period, Larson defied the bourgeois religious faith and bucked conventional gender norms epitomized by the sacrificial good woman. A recurring theme in both Larson's Quicksand and her 1928 novel Passing is the gulf between society's narrow expectations and her female protagonist's sense of self and subjectivity. In this regard, Quicksand is a stunningly contemporary indictment of black parochialism and moral repression. And so Larson's book encapsulates many of the themes and issues that the young A. Philip Randolph struggled with early on in his career, both as an organizer and an intellectual. But Randolph was effectively forced to downplay his secularism in light of the realities of the era. And the realities of the era were that African Americans were systematically excluded from white-dominated social, political, and economic institutions. And as a result, the black church played a towering role in political organizing, in providing African American professionals with the kind of ties that they needed to, quote unquote, move into the black middle class, in laying a foundation for every aspect of civic engagement, and in providing social welfare resources for African Americans of all classes. And so, as a result, Randolph and his colleagues go on to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was one of the most influential African American trade unions in American history. And they were motivated to do so by the deep and intractable white supremacy and racism of the labor movement in the United States, personified by the American Federation of Labor. And so the BSCP worked very strenuously to establish ties within the black faith community. But they were met with skepticism and resistance from some of the more conservative black congregations who were allied with the Pullman Company Union. And the Pullman Company Union had worked very vigorously to portray the BSCP as this hotbed of communism and radicalism, and atheism as well. And so Randolph, according to many biographers, retreats from many of his more radical positions on what he perceived to be the insidiousness of organized religion and the fixation on this theme of redemptive suffering within the African American community. And of course, Randolph goes on to found the March on Washington movement in the 1940s, initially to protest the exclusion of African Americans from wartime industries and the segregation of black troops. And so Randolph is part of the vanguard of African American intellectuals and activists who actively espoused secular humanist principles of social justice. And their ranks included W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an active critic of American imperialism and colonialism, in addition to third world missionary incursions led by the U.S. James Forman, a one-time head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also a very staunch critic of American imperialism and colonialism, in addition to being a critic of what he perceived to be the venality of black prosperity gospel preachers and the hypocrisy of the black church. Writers like Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and Richard Wright were all forerunning free thinkers who actively challenged the hold that the black church had on the black imagination and black political radicalism. Zora Neale Hurston was also an early African-American womanist and feminist advocate of free thought, intellectualism, and critical thinking in her nonfiction and fiction. And so the common theme amongst all of these thinkers and activists is a connection between capitalism, the hold that religiosity has on the black imagination with regard to black subjectivity and radicalism, and white supremacy. This has been a recurring theme within African American secular humanist discourse. And I think it's a theme that really distinguishes it from the trajectory of the new atheist movement here in the 21st century. And so, fast forward into the 21st century. There are no African Americans who are willing to assume the mantle of secularism, much less atheism or humanism, and this is part and parcel of the hysterical political atmosphere that has been strategically cultivated by the far-right reactionary attack dogs of the Fox regime. Michelle Bachmann, Glenn Beck, Newt Gingrich, the medievalist Sarah Palin have all sought to relentlessly connect liberal public policies, not radical public policies. Healthcare, of course, is being the font of socialism and communism. These liberal public policies with godlessness and anti-Americanism. And Newt Gingrich has even gone so far as to designate Barack Obama as the architect of the so-called secular socialist conspiracy, which on the face of it is patently egregious because Obama, of course, is very corporate identified, very imperialist, has extended the Bush regime, and very publicly Christian identified. But it really does not matter because the stagecraft, the cultural propaganda of the far-right reactionary attack dogs of the Fox regime are not just targeting Obama and his secularism, but there's also a critique, a canard against his quote-unquote racial otherness, a demonization of his racial otherness, as per the images that I just showed. And so it really does not matter how much Obama attempts to portray himself as a good uber-Christian who can cozy up with homophobes like the evangelical preacher Rick Warren, or how much he greenlights Bush's faith-based initiative regime, or how much he eloquently evokes scripture in his public addresses. He'll never be Christian enough for the white heartland. He'll never be secular or American enough for the birther Confederate reactionaries. And he'll never, ever be white enough to pass because within the white supremacist cultural logic of American ideology, one drop, if you're a black appearing person in the United States and you're walking down the street in South LA or in Detroit or Milwaukee, Wisconsin or Chicago or Harlem, one drop still makes you whole. So this notion of a Christian nation, which the Fox regime has been relentlessly flogging, in my mind has a very distinct racial provenance. And I was reminded of that racial provenance recently when I did a series of teacher training workshops in one of the South LA high schools that I work at. And this particular high school has a very high dropout rate, low four-year college going rate. At one point in time had an egregiously high suspension rate of African American students, and basically contributing to the school-to-prison pipeline that is institutionalized within American public education. But still a large number of students that are succeeding and excelling despite the demonization of this school. And so in one particular workshop, two teachers got into an exchange about whether or not the U.S. is in fact a Christian nation. And this was vis-a-vis a discussion that we were having about the heteronormativity and the heterosexism of American K-12 curricula. And so an African-American female teacher who's very Christian identified agreed that this is a Christian nation and was arguing with one of her white male colleagues who is notorious for making racist and paternalistic comments about the predominantly African-American and Latino student body at the school. And this particular white male teacher, in response, loudly proclaimed his non-belief and said that it was absurd to believe that the U.S. had had not always been steeped in the separation of church and state. And so while this debate was raging, I was acutely aware of the racial nuances, the racial privileges, when it comes to proclaiming one's non-belief in a public context. The fact that you can be the most disreputable white non-believer and still not surrender your claim to universal subject status, still not relinquish your hold on being considered human and being considered a person. And that has been the rub and the paradox for black non-believers. The fact that Christianity has been a de facto gateway, if you will, into being considered a person, being considered human, being considered moral, and also being provisionally considered to be American. And there has been no greater performance of Americanism and Americana than that old-time Christian religion. At the height of the Jim Crow era, young white children could get an initiation into Americanism and justice in one bloody serving, when you have whole congregations assembled on Sundays with picnic baskets and binoculars to watch public lynchings, like they were theater or performance art or sport. And this was an education for white youth into what it meant to be white and free, because the family and the congregation that prayed and lynched together stayed together. And so there's this great short story by Alice Walker called The Flowers, written in the 1970s. And I mentioned Walker for two reasons. One, because she's a forerunning African-American feminist and womanist, but also a critic of organized religion and religiosity from a more spiritual humanist perspective. And so in this story, Walker evokes the horror of a young African-American girl who's out picking flowers and discovers the decomposing corpse of a lynching victim. And in very simple and eloquent prose, she underscores the contradictions of a nation that has always vividly and strenuously portrayed itself as a paradigm of individual liberty and democracy and sovereign citizenship, but has done so through the erasure of its history of racial terrorism and racial disenfranchisement. And so the story concludes with a simple parting salvo, and then the summer was over, which signifies not just the end of summer, the figurative end of summer, but also the end of the possibility of innocence for this black child. The fact that to be a black child at any point in the U.S.'s exceptionalist history is to be othered, pathologized, embodied, racialized, and criminalized. Signifying that to be a black female child is never to exist within a position of innocence or preciousness or beauty. And what it evokes for me is the fact that for many of my students, their realities are that they will have a greater opportunity in this exceptionalist democracy to cycle in and out of juvenile detention facilities than they will to go to a four-year college and university. And this is what the writer Michelle Alexander has characterized as the new Jim Crow. And so, for me, a humanist notion of social justice that is based on cultural relevance foregrounds the paradoxes of these posts. Foregrounds the fact that despite the portrayal of the U.S. as this font of boundless liberty and opportunity, despite that there are greater numbers of young women of color who are going on to colleges and universities, they are still being taught when they open up a textbook, when they turn on the TV, when they view the media, when they go to a Hollywood film, they're still being taught to marginalize, question, and devalue themselves within this hierarchy of femininity and race. They're still being shown that their ultimate social worth lies in being attractive and desirable to a man. they're still being indoctrinated to believe that caregiving is really their authentic destiny in life. And that caregiving involves backbreaking self-sacrifice that men and boys should not be held accountable for. And they're still being shown that their sexuality is a proprietary object that should be used, controlled, exploited, and disposed of by organized religion / theocracy and the state. And they're still being not so subtly shown that women who buck this authoritarian regime of power and control are basically bad bitches. So if there has been so much post-feminist progress, where are the alternative models of masculinity in American culture? The paradigm shift whereby male sexuality is just as coveted and valuable a commodity as female sexuality. Why hasn't a culture of male caregiving and anti-violence emerged? Where is this liberated universe where women and girls can walk down the street, walk down the halls at school, or go to sleep in their own beds without fear of assault? Good women accept that violence against women is just a way of life. Male saviors bent on retribution and divine justice mandated